Hello, this is a supplemental podcast for the East Asian religions module, picking up on some of the bits we touched on in the lecture on the introduction of Christianity to China, and going into slightly more depth for those who weren't there. Some key critical points to bear in mind start not so much in China itself, but in India. Back in 1757, the East India Company, which was, as you know, a British-owned company, started planting opium poppies in India and growing opium fields under license with their own employed farmers and landowners and what have you, and peasants to tend the crop and harvest it and the rest of it. Some of that opium that was being grown, some of the opium poppies, were used to make medications like laudanum, which was trademarked a few years down the line. Opium has always had medicinal usage since very, very early periods of human history. However, as we know, opium is also highly addictive, and heroin is just another variation of opium. So whilst some of the opium grown in India was sold to doctors and pharmaceutical companies to make medications and so forth, the vast majority of the opium sold was consumed recreationally by drug addicts. And there was a huge market for recreational use of heroin in China. There had been for a while. This isn't something that the British brought to China. There already was a taste for it. But the Chinese emperors had been attempting to crack down on opium usage in China because they saw it, pretty much as we do these days with the heroin trade, as a really dangerous thing that was ruining lives and reducing people to a ruinous state. So initially the trade of British-grown opium from India across to China was conducted illegally. They'd smuggle in opium and sell it to Chinese merchants and retailers who would trade it for silver, and then they would go off and distribute the opium through their network of doss houses and things like that, where people could smoke opium, either of very, very poor people or some in much more luxurious surroundings, because it was also used by the upper classes. The silver that the British merchants got, they used to buy porcelain, those famous Chinese plates and vases and what have you, and tea. There was a huge market for tea, quite a big market for porcelain as well, but an absolutely massive market for tea. To give you an idea, in the year 1800, 23 million pounds of tea was sold by the Chinese to the British, let alone any other country that they were selling to. In that 1 year, 23 million pounds of tea. That's a phenomenal amount of tea. And it was quite an expensive thing. If you're ever traipsing around an antique shop, you might come across an old wooden tea caddy from that period, with little boxes that have compartments in them for keeping your tea in. Most tea caddies from the Victorian period or earlier have locks on the front. And the idea was not just to stop spillages and the box tipping over, but so that the master or the mistress of the house, when they weren't drinking tea, could lock it and pocket the key to make sure the servants wouldn't be able to take the tea for themselves, because it was such an expensive thing. It wasn't considered suitable for the servants to have access to. They could reboil the tea leaves after the master and mistress and the owners of the house had their serving of tea. So the pot was taken away, the tea leaves dried out, and then reboiled to make very weak, watered-down tea for the servants and the working classes to use. It gives you an idea of how expensive it was, and it was a very big money trade. The Chinese tea merchants and tea traders, there was very little being produced and made in Britain that they didn't already have plenty of in China, or just didn't want in the first place, didn't appeal to Chinese tastes. About the only thing they did want was silver. So part of the opium trade was to acquire the silver that they could then sell and use to trade with the Chinese tea growers. But I suppose when all is said and done, there is only so much silver anybody wants, and it placed a limit on how much tea could be traded, simply because the tea merchants didn't always want the price that was being offered to them. They could sell their tea to other countries and get what they wanted from other places. So this started to become a bit of a problem. By 1773, the East India Company had monopolised opium growing in India. So they had introduced laws in India, enforced laws in India, to say that only their fields were allowed to grow opium. So any rival farmers trying to grow opium, the law would come crashing down upon them. They could face arrest. Sometimes they would get shot and what have you, in feuds, almost like drug wars, really. So the East India Company came to control this, not just from rival Indian farmers, but also, for example, the Dutch East Indies Company and the French East India Company and so forth. There were all these rival European countries that were trying to muscle in on the trade. So the British East India Company essentially got there first and put a stop to it. So they became the major opium dealers, both for medicinal and for recreational usage in the area. By 1839, this had started to spill over. Incidentally, these dates are on the PowerPoint if you need to refer to them for essays or whatever, personal interest. By 1839, a couple of incidents kicked off. The Chinese government had got so fed up with British merchants flouting the laws banning opium dealing that they used their agents to track down one of the major warehouses in Canton. And they found 1,400 tons worth of heroin being stored in this warehouse. Which is, as you can imagine, is a phenomenal amount of opium being all stored up in lots of little boxes and what have you. And they seized it. So almost a kind of echoes of the Boston Tea Party. They seized the opium from this British warehouse that was holding it illegally and were determined to destroy the opium that they had seized to stop it from flooding the Chinese market and leading to even more addiction. It's estimated by various historians that somewhere in the region of about 10 million Chinese people were hooked on opium at this point in history. So it's a phenomenal market all over China for the stuff. At roughly the same time, there was an incident involving some sailors, British sailors, who had murdered Chinese people in a drunken bar fight, who were arrested by the Chinese government and were going to be tried in a Chinese court, but the British wanted them tried in a British court. And if they ended up being sent to prison or whatever, it would be a British prison, not a Chinese prison. So there was this sort of diplomatic dispute going on. These two events came to a head, and the British reaction, particularly more so to the seizing of the opium than to the incidents with the sailors, was to send in the navy. And basically a whole fleet of British warships sailed to China and started bombarding Canton when the Chinese refused to play ball. And this led to the first of the Opium Wars, which rolled on for a number of years and led to an awful lot of deaths, most of them Chinese deaths. Very few of the British sailors and militia died. Their weaponry was more sophisticated, more effective than the Chinese weaponry of the time, and so it's predominantly we're looking at Chinese deaths rather than British deaths. Eventually the Chinese government succumbed, and part of the agreement, it was a sort of series of aspects to this agreement. Partly the Chinese government, in the person of the emperor, agreed to pay for the 1,400 tons of heroin that had been opium rather that had been destroyed. So they essentially had to pay the drug dealers for this illegal drug. Then they had to cede the island of Hong Kong to become a colony and a trading port for the British, and obviously that remained in British hands for quite a long period of time before eventually being given back. And they had to allow unrestricted access not only to British merchants at 5 different ports whereas previously they'd only had the one port of Canton they were allowed to trade in. But they also had to allow in British missionaries. That was part of the deal, that the missionaries could then come in and have unrestricted access to travel around China, preaching, setting up churches and what have you. Prior to this, the Chinese emperors had tried to heavily restrict the impact of British and other Western Christian missionaries from coming to China. So politics, drug dealing and religion all started to interface in China at this point in time, which is all somewhat grim. Meanwhile, having seen the humiliation heaped upon the Qing dynasty of having to pay for the opium and having to give away Hong Kong and all the rest of these things that were going on, and feeling the presence of the West, a lot of Chinese people became very disillusioned and disgusted with their own government, with the Qing dynasty. And felt they were very weak, they had become very corrupt, they weren't effective at all in dealing with these foreign powers. One of the side effects of the incoming missionaries was that one of them encountered a Chinese chap called Hong Zhongquan. Hong Zhongquan was, well, you could argue he was possibly slightly disturbed, mentally disturbed. Maybe he was a visionary. Maybe he was a political extremist. There's all sorts of ways you could label him and describe him. But he was very receptive to the message of this Christian missionary. Hong in Chinese means flood. And in his own writings and accounts, he talks about talking with this missionary and reading some literature that the missionary brought along, which had been translated into Chinese by people like Robert Morrison, who was an early Protestant missionary to China, who also worked for the East India Company as a translator. So again, trade, corruption in terms of the opium dealing and religion were all working together. Hong hears the story about God sending the great flood to wash everyone away when they don't do as they're told because they're wicked and naughty, and how Noah sails the waves in the ark after the flood. And his reaction is that because his name means flood, he is therefore the flood, not the one that Noah sailed on, but the new flood. So just as God destroyed the wicked people back in the days of Noah by drowning them in the great flood, so God has sent this new force into China himself, Hong, to flood through China and wash away all of the wicked, corrupt people. Chiefly he's thinking of the Qing dynasty and the representatives of the dynasty who are weak and unable to stand up against British corruption, unable to deal with the opium dens and all of the problems that the British are bringing. So even though it's a British missionary who's given him the idea, and nonetheless he sees it as his mission to wash away wickedness by bringing his brand of Christianity, which is mostly the same as the forms of Christianity we're used to in the West, but with a few additional changes. So he wants the sexes to be segregated in order for people to resist temptation. He's quite exceedingly strict about things like homosexuality and premarital sex and adultery and so on. So everyone's got to be segregated, which I'll grant you doesn't do much to stop homosexuality, but to stop heterosexual premarital shenanigans, and live quiet, regimented lives in all sorts of ways. Plus, he feels himself to be the Son of God. He doesn't feel himself to be Jesus. He's not one. There's been loads of people in history who've all stood up and claimed that they were Jesus. But he feels himself to be an incarnation of God's second son. So Jesus is the first son. And then Hong's argument is that God has a second son, a Chinese son. So he's not exactly Jesus' younger brother. He's not saying he was James or one of those figures from the Bible. Rather, he is saying he's a brand new son of God, the flood, come to purge China of all these wicked, corrupt, terrible people. So his brand of Christianity is somewhat unusual compared to what we're more used to in the West. And a lot of the imagery he uses to talk about what God looks like, what angels look like, and so forth, because he has lots of visions of angels, and the angels come to give him guidance on all sorts of issues, how to wage battles and all of this sort of thing, because he does get into a lot of battles as his ideas spread across. And the Qing dynasty find out that he is very anti-Qing, so that they tried to crack down on his religious movement. So he gets into lots of warfare with the Qing dynasty, and the angels guide him in this warfare. He describes God and the angels and these various forces he's encountering in terms that are very, very familiar to Taoists, in the sense that the appearance, the style are taken by God and by angels and other central Christian figures is very much in keeping with the depiction of Taoist gods and divine figures from Taoist mythology. So it's a sort of fusion of Christian ideas that he's acquired from Western missionaries, but also a lot of traditional Chinese Taoist and Shandaoist concepts and notions and imagery. And he does remarkably well. His movement spreads through loads and loads and loads of villages all around rural China, draws in huge numbers of people as converts who are moved not only by his preaching about living pure lives and moral lives and so on, but also his idea of social reform and social revolution, to sweep away the corrupt and useless Qing dynasty, to replace them with a brand new dynasty, with himself eventually in due course as the new emperor, founding this sort of new wave, to purify the land, to strengthen the land, that China will become God's chosen land. So it's a very appealing message to a lot of people who have been ground down into poverty, very, very ill-used by the Qing dynasty, that had the typical arrogance of the aristocrat when it came to the treatment of peasants and farmers who starved in large numbers quite often. Famines and starvation and plagues were frequent problems for Chinese peasants at that point in history. The years roll on and he leads this, what's termed the Taiping Rebellion, this militant resistance to the Qing dynasty. Battles break out here and there, loads of people die. In the aftermath of the rebellion, the combined deaths during the war and in the aftermath, mostly through starvation caused by the destruction of fields, slaughtering of the working men who would till the fields and so on. 30 million people die in a matter of a few years. 30 million. Just if you can get your head around that scale of a number. A phenomenal impact on Chinese culture. Whilst the Taiping Rebellion is going on, the British, this time in alliance with the French, decide that the Qing dynasty is still resistant to their wishes to have extensive opium trading in China. Opium is still illegal, despite the treaty, the Nanking Treaty, in which the Qing Emperor had paid for the destroyed opium. So the British and the French, in cahoots, decide to launch the Second Opium War in 1856. So they're seizing the fact that the Qing dynasty, which was never very strong to start with, is consumed with the battles taking place trying to put down the rebellion of Hong and the Taiping Rebellion. So the Qing dynasty is battling these, shall we say, Christian extremists, for lack of a better description, on the one hand, and they're battling the British and the French in an opium-fueled war on the other hand. Needless to say, the Qing dynasty does not come out of this very well at all. And all but crumbles, and it's not long after that the Qing dynasty has gone entirely. The dynasty eventually sue for peace in the Second Opium War. By 1860, they end up with the Treaty of Tientsin. The Treaty of Tientsin required, amongst various other things, that the opium trade is made completely legal. So it not only ripples across China, as it's been doing for decades anyway, but it does so openly. People trade openly, they're no longer trading secretively. So the British and the French between them basically force the Chinese government to accept opium addiction, widespread mass opium addiction, and heroin dealing, opium dealing in the streets, in dens and what have you, so that people can go and buy the stuff perfectly legally and go and use it perfectly legally. So it becomes a massive problem. It's perhaps no huge surprise that opium addiction does not stay in China. As the Chinese diaspora is taking place, people are going from China to America, they're going from China to Australia to work in a lot of the mining regions over there, and of course they're going to Britain and various other European countries. So you're getting areas like Limehouse in London, where you get a big immigrant Chinese community, forming like a Chinatown, essentially, in London. Not only do they come in as shopkeepers and tailors and all the usual kinds of jobs that people do, but some of them bring in their opium addictions with them, or at least their opium dealing with them, and they start setting up opium dens in London and other big cities in Britain. In China, some of the opium dens were quite upmarket, quite nice areas. Others were the sort of cheap rubbish end of the opium trade, of very poor people buying very low-grade opium and getting wrecked, just lying there in a heap in a flea bed. Often seeing their lives go down the toilets in the process, and I'm sure there must have been lots of people who started off in the posh opium dens, and as their money frittered away, they ended up going down and down to the grottier and grottier opium dens, which is exactly what we see happening in Britain. You get people who have big family estates and mansion houses and all the rest of it, blowing their family fortunes in opium dens. And they start off in the posh opium dens and the salons, and they end up poorer and poorer and poorer and poorer, and then they're in the Limehouse doss houses, basically, in these grotty, flea-infested places, totally off their skull on opium. The kind of things that people who make Victorian melodramas on TV love to include. It's very sort of Sherlock Holmesy, the swirling fogs and people completely off their faces in opium dens became a serious problem in London, and something that the British government finally decided it had to try and do something about when it realised it wasn't just the poorest of the poor destroying their bodies and their minds in these places. It was quite well-to-do people as well who were destroying themselves in these places. That's the period of time when you start getting a panic about the threat of China to the West, which is irony of ironies, given it is the West that have threatened China throughout and imposed this on China. So you get people like Sax Rohmer and other authors in the coming decades writing novels, thrillers, whodunits, that sort of thing, involving sinister Chinese characters who come along plying innocent young things with their opium dealing. And these very caricatured, what we by modern standards would class as very racist images of Chinese people as villains, totally oblivious to the fact that Chinese opium dealers only really came into existence because the British had imposed opium dealing on China. Now, one of the other knock-on impacts of this, coming back to the religious studies bit and not going too way down the history side of this, is that for an awful lot of Chinese people, Christianity was something heavily identified with the opium trade, because the British had brought opium, big scale, into China, and with them and with the various treaties, with the Tientsin Treaty and the Nanking Treaty, the demand for religious access, for missionary access, had been part and parcel. It wasn't just saying you've got to buy our opium, it was saying you've got to allow our religion, almost buy our religion along with our opium. And the two often going hand in glove. And people like Robert Morrison we've already mentioned, who were missionaries translating the Bible into Chinese, but also acting as translators for the East India Company in their opium dealing and in their various other porcelain dealing and tea buying and everything else that they were getting up to at the same time. So there's this overlap between religion and the much more malevolent commercial interests of the British and the French as well within China. And of course, with the rebellion being led by Hong, Christianity became seen as this force that would overthrow the Qing dynasty. Those who hated the Qing dynasty probably thought that was a good thing, but there were plenty of people who were either loyal to the Qing dynasty or at least saw the devastation, those 30-odd million people dying left, right and centre in war and in starvation and famine afterwards, who felt that this was heavily the fault of the British, but chiefly in that case it was the fault of the British missionaries who had brought Christianity in, and it came to be seen as a sort of threatening religion, as a violent religion. And the sorts of attitudes you get lots of people having, getting their knickers in a twist about Islam these days, and always it sort of extremist and political and this and that and the other, those are the kinds of things that a lot of Chinese people felt about Christianity, that it was this sinister, dodgy thing from the West, from Britain mainly, that was coming in and corrupting their way of life, turning nice little farmers into homicidal maniacs who would go around not per se blowing things up, but shooting people, stabbing them, beheading them in the warfare of the day. There's some bombing as well going on, but mainly slightly more sedate forms of warfare and conflict. That whilst people were not being forced to convert at sword point, they were certainly defending their faith in a very military manner, and that faith was tied hand in glove with political revolution, because God and the angels had instructed Hong that he had to flood through the land, get rid of the corruption of the Qing dynasty, get rid of the Qing emperor, get rid of the royal family, get rid of all of the toadies and the sycophants in the royal courts, and replace them with decent, upstanding Christian people, and wash away the past. Eventually, the Taiping Rebellion come 1864 falls flat. Hong is executed, loads of other people are executed, and it dies a death. But the legacy, the memory of it remains a long time. And there are still buildings and churches he erected that are standing in China to this very day. Nowadays they're mostly museum pieces more than anything else. But they're still there. They are a legacy of that period of history. If we fast forward into just only a few decades down the line, into the early 1900s, we start to see the emergence of an anti-Christian movement in China, which has memories for a lot of its members who are old enough to have lived through the Taiping Rebellion and to remember all of the British bombardments and the British attitudes around bringing in missionaries along with their opium and the rest of it, have come to fear not just the anti-Christian movement didn't like really any religion at all. It regarded all religion, Buddhism, Taoism, everything else, as superstitious mumbo-jumbo nonsense of the past. They wanted to ditch all religion and move into a very scientific, technological future. But particularly they didn't like Christianity more so than the other religions because of this association with foreign menace. It was this dodgy religion of a foreign country being used to manipulate and convert. Similar attitudes and experiences developed in Japan with the perception that Catholicism was a sinister foreign threat that was going to undermine the Japanese way of life. I might do a separate podcast on that one later if I get the time. Once the Qing dynasty collapsed entirely, and the Boxer Rebellion took place and various other big-scale military events took place across China, you start to see various movements emerging. In the initial period, you got the beginnings of the Republican movement that wants to do away entirely with the emperor, the royal family, do away with the aristocrats and all that nonsense, and have a people's republic in place. And for a while it succeeds and it gets it. But a rift develops between the People's Republic and, a couple of decades later, the emerging wish for communism in the form of Mao Zedong leading his communist revolution, and the Republicans and the communists smashing head on. Both of them are anti-royalist. Both of them are fundamentally anti-religious and regard religion as all wrapped up with royalism, the idea of the emperor as a living god and all that kind of thing. Regarded as superstitious, regarded as regressive, backward-looking. And again, it doesn't matter whether we're talking Buddhism, Taoism, any other ism. It's all seen as backward. But particularly this concern that Christianity is not only backward, but foreign with it, and represents an imperial menace from the West. There's a lot of argument to be had, and if we wanted to make this podcast twice the length it is, we could go into it here, but maybe something for you to reflect on and think about. What is the relationship between religion and imperialism? Particularly in recent centuries, between Christianity and imperialism. Because so often when imperial commercial interests, like the East India Company, have arrived in the country, missionaries have arrived 5 minutes later. And you get lots of quotes along the line that the missionaries came in and told us to kneel down and pray. When we stood up, we had Bibles and they had our land. That religion and commercialism and trade interests have not been wholly separate for a long time. Who funds the missionaries? Who pays for their travel to foreign lands? Who pays for them to set up churches? Why do they pay for them to set up churches? There's more than one group of people funding churches and missionaries and funding the translation of the Bible into the language of the country it's coming into. But often trade interests are part of that. For some people it's a purely conversionary seal that motivates them to donate money towards these sorts of things. But for others, there is the assumption that if we can bring in our religion, we bring in our culture, our values, our ideas along with it, which will make this foreign nation of people's more malleable to our interests, more sympathetic to our interests, more willing to go along with our commercial endeavours. Therefore, we will make more money, and some of that can go on spending churches, on building churches, and be donated to worthy causes and so on. But how do we ever fully disentangle the roots of greed and commercialism and avarice from the idealism of religion? This wish to save souls and lead people from what's perceived as their false beliefs of the past into a better set of beliefs that are being offered to them, at least better in the minds of the missionaries, if nobody else. It's a very knotty problem, a very entangled problem, and this is not obviously purely something of the past. The worst excesses of things like the Opium Wars we can put into previous centuries. But if you listen to the rhetoric of a lot of modern day politicians, you think of American politicians, British politicians and so on, when they're talking about military action in foreign countries, often these days the talk is of bringing them democracy, with the same kind of zeal that a few generations earlier previous prime ministers and presidents were talking about bringing Christianity. And for some prime ministers and some presidents, those who have, or at least claim to have, devout beliefs of their own, what's the relationship between democracy and Christianity? Between their brand, the British, American, or whatever brand of democracy, and their beliefs around their flavour, their particular style of Christianity? Are these wholly separate things, Or is the assumption that you bring in the one, you bring in the other? Because whatever religion is already in that country, which is seen as unsympathetic towards democracy, otherwise they'd already have it, is it just the political system that is being sought to change? Currently, it's quite topical to talk about regime change, and no, we're not going to change regimes, and then they do. What is the new regime? Is it just a couple of new politicians, or is it a whole new way of thinking, democracy, etc., or is it a whole new way of believing, of behaving, of living? Where does the one end and the other begin? How do we wholly disentangle them? There are some enormously rich individuals who fund political parties, who may be profiting from trade in conquered countries, rebuilding them, somehow mysteriously acquiring their oil resources and other things in the process. And some of those individuals are quite strong in their religious convictions as well. So politics and trade and religion build upon one another as much today in the 21st century as they did back in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. And often in as murky a way. And, well, hopefully we're not looking at 30 million dead, but we might be looking at quite large numbers of people still dying in the process of bringing in these changes, bringing in these new ideas, whether they are genuinely wanted by the people that they're being given to or not. So just something to reflect upon and contemplate what your own personal views on that are, your own reading around the subject, and perhaps news stories that you may be following, that sort of thing, about this relationship between imperialism and religion, not only in the Victorian past and earlier periods of history, but in the current international climate that we're experiencing at the moment, and where you perceive this as going in the future, because clearly this isn't going to end any time soon. So maybe something we can discuss in a future lecture.